All right, we're recording, so I think I'm good to say welcome to the webinar. This is hosted by the North Central Climate Collaborative. We're an organization of extension folks across the North Central region who are focused on weather and climate education and outreach. So we are really looking to provide great climate resources that apply to all facets of agriculture across the North Central region. This webinar today is a part of our webinar series, which covers climate and agriculture and all sorts of great topics. This is a bi-monthly webinar series, so feel free to get registered and get on our contact list so you can be notified for future webinars. And all of our recordings are available on our website. Please subscribe to our newsletter and get plugged in with North Central Climate Collaborative. Today, we're really excited to have Madison Kopp joining us. She is with the Lake Area Technical College in South Dakota and works as an agriculture instructor there. She has a bachelor's of science and master's of science in animal science from South Dakota State University. And we'll be talking about cattle production today. So I will go ahead and let Madison take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Maddie. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. Before I actually came to Lake Area Tech, I was in extension, so with SDSU. And so kind of getting able to step back into those shoes is something that I am really excited for. I'm going to share my screen before I get too far ahead of myself. So hopefully everybody can see this as it is loading and pulling up. As if you were looking at registering, kind of the topic of conversation today is exploring how the environment and nutrition drives water intake in growing beef cattle. This is actually research that I did for my master's degree while I was at SDSU. So this all came from down in Brookings, and we'll kind of highlight that study here in a minute. But with this, it's something that we've, in the recent past, water intake has been something that a lot of producers are starting to concern themselves with. A lot of research is starting to look into if this is something that we've been missing the mark. We spend a lot of time doing research on the nutrition side of what's the best feed, what's the best diet that we can feed, when sometimes water gets a little bit left behind in that same conversation. So we'll get to talk about a lot of different things. And if I nerd out a little bit, just bringing back that master's defense that wasn't too long ago, but it should be a good conversation to have. All right. So to start, kind of what's on the agenda or what we're going to go through in our time together today. I'll do some introductory type things where we talk about why this study would have happened, why it's necessary to kind of start looking into it now versus in the past, just some kind of background information so we're all on the same page. Talk a little bit about the study at SDSU, why we did what we did, and what we were looking for. And then kind of finish things out. How did we get it done? So what did we do? What did we find out? And ultimately at the end, I did this study. Why does it matter to the general public, to those involved in climate, those of us on the animal production side? Ultimately, kind of the big question of, so what? Now what do we do with it? So that's kind of the plan for today, just so that we're all aware of where we'll be kind of heading throughout this presentation. Okay. So to start as introduction, pretty basic comment of water's important. And I can about hear everybody's eyes rolling in the back of their head of, well, duh, obviously it's important. We've all been told from when we were kids that drinking your water in July is important. When you take livestock anywhere, making sure that they have water also. If we have livestock out in pastures or in pens, there's always a conversation of, is the tank flowing? Is it frozen? All of those things. So we've all been told that water is important, but it's a nutrient that often gets forgotten and put to the wayside when we really start to put the nuts and the bolts together of cattle nutrition and cattle performance. And so why is it important? Again, we understand that's important, but the things that are going to start flashing on your screen of the whys, these are all processes in the body that water plays a integral role of. So from regulation of body temperature all the way down to milk production, the metabolism, reproduction, none of these processes can happen efficiently if we do not have adequate water in the system. And so if we're not having adequate water and my cattle are not breeding back at the rate that I thought that they would, it could be as simple as they need more water or fresh water, or there's something in that water that's preventing it, versus I could be doing everything else right. So there's a lot of small things that play into the conversation. And when you really start to think about it, it kind of makes you sit back and really ruminate on what's happening, about why we make sure those tanks are clean and why we make sure those tanks are full. And on the research side of things, to be honest, water research is lacking, especially on the cattle side. A majority of the studies that we refer to today are going to be done in the 1950s and 60s. So this is a lot of the numbers that we are referring to come from a original study done in 1956. And also a lot of that data comes from cattle fed for slaughter or cattle that are in our feedlot systems. There wasn't a lot of information on animals with a reproductive purpose, our bulls, our heifers, our cow herds. A lot of it was those more terminal animals in this case. And additionally, we all worry about water in warmer climates. When things get hot, we tend to make sure that water bottles are full for sports practice, and we tend to make sure that the water tanks are running at full capacity. But in South Dakota, we have warm climates, but we're arguably, in my opinion, a little more cold for most of the year than we are warm. So trying to see how that changes impacts of water intake and how much water cattle drink. In terms of water requirements, rule of thumb says that we should be giving a gallon of water per 100 pounds of body weight. And in this case, we run into where if we have animals with calves outside, they're lactating, they're producing milk, things like that, their water requirements actually jump up to about 2 gallons per 100 pounds of body weight. But that being said, that doesn't really tell us a whole lot, right? That tells us what they require, but we don't know what else changes that. And again, that equation that we've used historically was developed by two very smart people in 1956, Winchester and Morris. And that equation, when you go to look up any sort of cattle nutrition, that's going to be the equation that you'll see in all of our reference materials, all of our books, all of those things is what you'll see. To no surprise to anybody, cattle have changed over the years. These are two pictures from SDSU, the one on the left of the Hereford bull. That was one of the original animals at the cow-calf unit, the one on the right. That is a Simmental Angus cross bull that won in Little International, I believe, for showmanship in 23. So many years have passed between these two animals existing. But the biggest thing is that animal on the left is going to be shorter in stature, going to fatten sooner. Ultimately, a different goal than that animal on the right, who's going to be our high production, heavy muscled, fast growing animal. And having that big of metabolic changes, body changes, we can only imagine is going to impact ultimately the requirements of water, nutrient requirements, all of those things as we start to expect more from these animals, as we start to kind of push the limits on what we can and can't do. Not only have the cattle changed, but also our production and our kind of our management strategies that we do with that as well have changed drastically from the 1950s to now, just where cattle are housed, how they're housed, what they're fed, how they're managed, bred, all of the things have changed drastically. And we should be taking that into account as we're making these conversations. And all of you again are like, Madison, get to the point. We know water is important. We know cattle have changed. But I want to hear more. And I hear you. So we'll move on out of introduction into the objective side of things. And kind of some big things that I've already mentioned as to why this study happened. Water intake has been historically difficult to quantify. And by that, I mean, it's very hard to get water intake on a per animal basis to do research like this. We actually went through and measured how much water every one of these animals drank in a day, and you'll get to see the equipment that allowed us to do that here in a couple of slides. But historically, it's just been difficult to do. So if it has been difficult, the materials are hard to come by, the equipment is expensive. How do we go about finding the answer to this question? So that was hurdle number one. The second one, we wanted to look at bulls and heifers, so those animals on the reproductive side rather than feedlot animals. Wanted to see if being raised for a different purpose kind of changed what we were looking for, and also how colder climates affected water intake. We had these cattle on trial over the winter months, so we really got to test our limits on what we were doing for colder climates. And ultimately, the question that we wanted to answer was determining the effects of weather variables, body weight, and feed intake on total daily water intake and liquid daily water intake in growing beef cattle. That's kind of to summarize everything that I just said, that's the big question that we were looking to solve with this project. So how did we get it done? These bulls in the back of this picture, these were my first group of bulls that went through this study. They were kind of the ones that paved the way of how we were going to handle the next years. But some things to keep in mind in terms of definitions. So I mentioned this in the objective, but there's two big definitions that are going to come up periodically through this, and that's going to be total daily water intake, or TDWI. And total daily water is referring to what they drink as well as what just naturally occurs in the diet. Okay. There is a certain amount of water in the diet that we need to account for because through the digestive process, it does make its way into the body the same way that drinking water would. When we look at liquid daily water intake, or LDWI, that's what we were looking at for only the water that they drink. So we weren't taking into account water that naturally comes in the diet. So we did it both ways to see if this was impacted differently based on weather, all those things. This picture on this slide on the right, this is one of the Incintec watering systems. So the system we use is the Incintec RIC system. And these green boxes work fantastic. They're a little bit of a pain in the butt to work with over the winter, but how this system actually works is they come in typically through that large kind of Y-shaped opening. There's going to be a black gate up. These were out of commission for the year at this point. We didn't have any cattle in the pen, so we were able to close them down for a while. But cattle would come in, they're able to drink out of this tank, and it weighs how much water was in there when they started, and it weighs how much water was there when they left. So essentially, we're getting the disappearance of the water while that animal was in there. Kind of the rough and tumble version of how these work, but that's how we were able to get an individual animal intake. It tracks each animal that goes into this system, how much disappears while they were there, and they can back out. We had a similar system. It's built a little differently. I unfortunately don't have a picture of it in here today. But we had the same idea of a system for tracking feed intake as well. So we were able to get both of those intakes very specifically down to the animal, down to the hour that we were experiencing for all of the bulls and all of the heifers that were on this study. For weather data, we were able to use the South Dakota Mesonet system. Very thankful for all of them there. They were able to get us the data that we needed and also help us work with it a little bit. We were able to use the Brookings station. It's across town from the cow-calf unit where our animals were held. So it's not directly the weather that they were experiencing real time in the pens, but it was giving us a good starting point of what these animals were experiencing. So the variables that we were able to receive from the Mesonet system that we used in our analysis or when we were looking at it was the minimum, maximum, and average in both air temperature as well as relative humidity. We also were able to gather data on wind speed and the wind chill. and then finally solar radiation. So we had a lot of numbers and data points to refer to, not only for feed and water intake, but also the weather that we were looking at in order to compare back and forth. So we actually, for this study, looked at 2 years of data. So both studies ran from about November, early November to the end of February. The reason we cut off at the end of February is these animals, these bulls and these heifers, actually take part in our little international show down at SDSU. Students are able to start coming into work with those animals at the beginning of March. And so at that point, we're altering their behavior. They're not in the pen the same amount of time. So we really had to be intentional about what we were analyzing, and if what we were seeing was due to weather or if it was due to that student had taken that animal out for a couple of hours and brought them back, and if that disturbed all the other animals in the pen. So we cut it off right before Little International. And these calves got weaned in October. And the reason we didn't start right away in October is that instant tech system takes them a little bit of time to learn. It takes about 3 to 4 weeks for them to fully learn how that system works, and that we're confident that they understand how to get in and out of the bunks efficiently, that every single animal is using it properly. So we give them some learning time to kind of figure things out, and that really changes year to year. So that's why we had about that almost 10-day difference between those 2 years and start time. But ultimately, that November to February time is what we were looking for in terms of weather and behavior that we were looking at. And again, we did bulls and heifers. These are our weaned heifers and weaned bulls, and we had them tell about their first birthday, and they were either Angus, so 100% Angus bred, or a Angus Simmental cross genetics. All of them are sourced from SDSU, all SDSU genetics. So we knew how these animals were raised and knew that wasn't going to be something that impacted us as well in this case. The diets that we fed to these animals were considered to be normal for this stage of production and the geographical area that we're in. And I say that because I am a nutrition nerd by heart, and I could go off into the weeds about the diets that they received. But for kind of general reasons, it was considered normal. We fed alfalfa hay, grass hay, corn silage, corn grain, as well as distillers grains, as well as a liquid supplement as well. So very, very general for the area, nothing too special for them. We wanted things to be practical so that this data could really start that conversation without being so focused on how we operate there that no one could really use it. So all of our animals were also housed in our monoslope facility at the cow-calf unit just outside of Brookings. So they were housed in a facility where about 30 feet-ish is underneath a roof, but the rest of their pen is out in the open. So they could both come in under a roof if they would like, but they were also outside in their open lot pens as well. So they weren't completely housed inside, but they also weren't completely in a true dry lot situation either. And again, that Instant Tech RIC system was used to track that feed and water intake for these animals inside that facility during this period of time. So that's kind of how we set things up, but ultimately the nuts and bolts of what did we find? These are going to look really intense. I promise I'll explain the equation here at the bottom. But for our bulls, we actually found that the variables didn't change whether we were looking at their total daily water or their liquid daily water. So the same variables impacted them regardless of what type of water we were looking at. And those variables are body weight and dry matter intake, so how heavy they were, how much they ate, which these are two variables that historically through research we understand have impacted water intake. These are kind of the basic things. The more they eat, the more they need to drink for digestion. The heavier they are, the more tissue they need to support with additional water. The weather variables that we saw that impacted them were average relative humidity, wind speed, and wind chill. The equation that you see on here below, this is actually what we were able to draft. Now, this equation isn't something that any of us at this point could take out and use in our operation. This is very rudimentary. This is very introductory into this. So this definitely needs a little bit more work in the future, some more data points to be put into it, more training to make it totally applicable for producers to go out and use. But it starts to highlight this picture of how potentially during the colder months, we may start looking at different ideas here. The heifers in natural fashion, if anybody's worked with heifers before, threw a wrench into my plan. They complicated things quite a bit in terms of their equations for total daily water as well as liquid water were different. And the biggest thing is that for their total daily water, it didn't seem to matter how heavy they were, more so just how much they ate. And instead of just humidity, wind speed, and wind chill, they also decided that solar radiation was something that was going to impact them outside of our bowls. When we move into liquid daily water, this is where things started to really kind of turn us on our heads, because suddenly body weight, average daily gain kind of go hand in hand on those two. Brought in that they mattered for liquid water, but not total water. So that was something that we weren't totally expecting. And I have some thoughts as to why that could have been seen, but we'll get to those here in a second. Here are those two equations. The one on the top is for total daily water. The one on the bottom is liquid daily water. Again, these aren't necessarily ones that I could take out to someone's operation and have them use, but something that we can start to use in the conversation of predicting water. Has it changed? What weather variables affect that? So this part of the project, ultimately a little lackluster in what we saw and how things can be used, but started a really good conversation, really good thoughts moving forward of how we're going to handle water intake and predicting it, making sure our animals have what they need. Ultimately, before I put the cart before the horse of talking about it earlier, why does it matter? Why do we care what weather variables impact livestock in this case? So we are beginning to better understand what affects animals in our colder climates. These are just some bullet points that I wanted to bring up in this case. The first one being what impacted our animals over the winter was wind chill versus just temperature. If you remember from the data that we collected, we did ask Mesonet for just temperature data, but when we actually ran it through our system, through our stats, we saw that wind chill was actually more predictive than temperature in what they were going to drink. And it was, I believe, either the first or the second most important variable in predicting how much water they were going to drink. Our thought process of this is it can be negative 20 degrees outside and not windy, and it's tolerable, right? The cattle behave a little differently, but ultimately they're going to be running through life normally. Versus if it is negative 20 degrees, but the wind is howling 40 miles an hour, the cattle really don't like to move from a spot where they've huddled up and they're next to their friends, keeping warm, protecting themselves from that wind. So wind chill, that fact of this is what the animals are actually feeling versus just the temperature as it is, just really alters their behavior. If you were out in the pens watching them on the days where it was really cold, wind chill, they pretty much came up to the barn when they had to, and that was typically when the feed truck drove by and dropped off their breakfast and their dinner. It was not just because they wanted to come up to get a small drink. They were coming up because they were either very, very thirsty or they knew that there was feed waiting for them up there. So their behavior changes quite a bit as our temperatures dip and as that wind chill starts to pick up or get more severe, just alters that behavior a little bit. In terms of humidity in winter weather, a lot of us think of humidity mattering in that 90-degree weather, that 80-degree weather. We start to worry about heat stress in our cattle. Where it comes in winter is that humidity or that moisture in the air actually takes away the insulative properties of their coats. Okay, so they're heavy winter coats that can keep them comfortable in cold temperatures start to become less efficient. So we run into the problem of they're feeling chilled, they're feeling colder if the humidity is higher. And when you feel cold, I think the last thing on our mind is drinking cold water out of a glass, and in their case, out of a tank. They're more worried about keeping feed in their bellies to keep them warm as that internal furnace. So realistically, humidity, we start to see that be an impact of just the quality of that hair coat being able to do its job. Solar radiation with the heifers, the things that really, again, it kind of spun us for a loop. We weren't really sure. One of the things with our heifer group is our heifers were a lot more diverse in not only their size. We had some heifers that came in relatively small, kind of end of the pack, and then we had some of the big girls that were one of the first ones born of the calving season, and they just came in a little bit more prepared. But these animals also spent a lot more time out in the pen than our bulls typically did. If our bulls were out there, typically they're going to be laying down on the bed pack that we give them to protect them from the cold in terms of frostbite on their testes and those type of things versus our heifers. We bed them to keep them comfortable, but we're not necessarily bedding them to prevent that sort of injury. So our thought was maybe they were just spending more time outside, absorbing that energy from the sun. They're black-hided cattle. So going out, spending time in that sunny weather, walking around the pen, versus our bulls maybe were more likely to stay under the roof, or they were more likely to just kind of lay down on that bed pack and stay comfy. Kind of going hand in hand with that. Another thing too to mention is our bulls that we have. These are all bulls that get bred and raised for the annual sale down at SDSU. So the group that ends up in that pen is very consistent. They are a group that there's not a whole lot of variation from the top end of the pen to the bottom. Versus our heifers, there's a lot more variability between just the animals themselves. So that also could have been a contributing factor into why our heifers had a little bit of a different equation than our bulls and why they had two versus just the one. And going back to the cattle industry continues to change both in animals, but also production methods. How we're pushing cattle to perform now is we want bigger, better, faster. And with that, these animals might start to represent that. Typically, our seed stock is going to push for that higher performance first, because ultimately those seed stock are what's going to come down and produce those animals that go into our feed yards to be that next push of beef that makes it to our dinner tables. So realistically, starting to keep in mind that animals are going to change, how we raise those animals is going to change, and keeping that at the forefront of our minds. And also, in that same breath of males versus females in terms of biologically are different in cattle for this. And with our males, testosterone in bulls is a hormone that is going to be in full swing, full operation. And testosterone really drives lean muscle growth. And lean muscle contains and needs more water than fat. And our heifers tend to put on fat sooner and easier than our bulls or our intact males do. So our heifers at the same weight as bulls typically are going to have more fat content on their body as compared to a bull at that point, just due to hormonal differences. So for a growing bull, do we need to take that into consideration when we design our facilities for pipe size or water tank space versus those heifer pens that we may have? So just some things to think about. Again, we need to do a lot more research in this area. Anything that I'm saying is not gospel at this point. Very, very introductory, starting to bring the light back to water research in livestock and in cattle specifically. With that, I do want to say thank you. The folks listed there are research is made possible by them, SDSU staff, professors, those at the cow-calf unit, as well as the Mesonet staff. This project wouldn't have happened down in Brookings without those people. I included my email there as well. And for my students that are listening, I had them jump on. This would be an excellent time to take that screenshot to upload to your assignment. So I will leave that warning there. But this research realistically would not have been possible without the folks listed, and forever thankful that they were willing to deal with frozen waters when it was negative 60-degree wind chill outside, to make sure that these animals and the data that we got was strong and solid in this case. But with that, I will hush up for a few minutes, see if any questions have come by. I've seen a couple things kind of pop up. I will stop my share and then we can kind of see where our discussion leads us.
Thank you, Madison. There were a couple questions in the Q&A. So if we could just start with that, and then if there's anyone online who would like to ask a question live, please feel free to do so. So we'll hit this first question and then open it up to online questions. If there are none, we'll come back to the second question. So the first question in the Q&A was, did you monitor water intake just during the summer?
We did not for this project, mostly because where our cattle are over the summer, they're out on summer grazing, and we do not have a method to track individual water intake. I know that's something in the future that they're wanting to potentially investigate, but in regards to this project, we did not look at the summer. We were only looking at them from November to the end of February.
Perfect.
Then, oh no, I think my internet is starting. Maybe we'll see. I see the next question while something is pulling up and loading of the percentage of dried distillers grains in there. I figured I should have put the data tables in here, but I did not. So let me find the original data tables that I have. I want to say it was somewhere in the, my internet's being so slow. Every year it was a little bit different, but for the most part, we tried to keep it as similar year to year as possible. So that we couldn't be faced with the accidental question of, did we change that? So year two is no longer the same as year one. Geez Louise, I don't know if I've ever met slower internet than right now, which is really driving me bonkers.
We can come back to that while that's loading if you want to
It's
answer.
almost here, but yeah,
Okay, no
we can do that.
worries. No
It's
worries.
almost here, so we'll come back to that, Kathy. But in terms of monitoring the temperature of the water, in our system and in our case, we did not. The one thing that I can say in terms of monitoring monitoring the water, it did come directly from the rural water system in Brookings. So we knew that our water quality was going to be the same. I did do, in prepping for my defense for this, did do some research into if temperature of drinking water affects how much they drink. And the biggest thing that they found is that cattle will naturally, if given the option, select water that is closer to their body temperature. So if you wanted to heat water in winter up to about 100 degrees, 90 to 100 degrees seemed ideal. That was where they seemed to select it the most. However, that being said, heating water to that temperature when it's as bitterly cold as we were dealing with these 2 years, it becomes the conversation of, is it economically sound to justify the electric bill to heat it that high? To us, it kind of was a catch-22 situation of you could and potentially get them to drink more, be encouraged to drink more, but also is the amount of performance I'm going to see realistically that much different for that bill that we're being faced. So ideally, cattle prefer water and drink more of it if it's closer to their body temperature, but then it brings up the question of dollars. Does it economically make sense to do so? And typically when it's hotter outside too, cattle will naturally eat less because of their digestive process. When they eat, they tend to increase their body temperature. So we run into the problem of they in hot weather kind of shut off on that case. I was able to finally get my PowerPoint to load with the percent of dry distillers. And we use dry distillers. They were sourced from the Volga Ag Center and our feed mill at SDSU. And every year they were about 14% of the diet, almost 15% of the diet dry matter for our bulls. And for our heifers, they were a little bit lower at about that 11 to kind of 10%. So our heifers didn't get as much as our bulls did, but ultimately around that, 15% diet dry matter to 11% diet dry matter on those. All right. I see one from John next. Do you have any data or thoughts on water intake and how it's impacted while they're grazing? I myself don't have any data to reference off the top of my head when it comes to grazing because tracking individual intake in a grazing scenario is, again, just very difficult to do. The biggest thing with grazing that we see is a lot of their water intake during that period of time is going to be driven by temperature regulation. So they're going to drink to cool themselves off. Also, depending on the wetness of the year, the grass as it grows can become, we call it washy in the livestock nutrition, but washy essentially means that the water content of that feed or of that grass is going to be higher. So they end up getting a lot more of their requirement just from the grass that they're eating. So that's kind of two big drivers is going to be that temperature in the summer and also just the water content of the grass. If we run into a drought year like we did several years ago, and as there's going to be drought years continuing, if that grass is drier, they need to drink more water for that digestive process to function as normal. So kind of both sides to that one for that, but ultimately kind of that weather and the forage moisture quality is going to be our two big points on that one. Do you think that there's a breed difference for water intake? If so, is there a priority to look more into it? If you look at previous research, the biggest breed difference that people will say is the difference between dairy and beef is going to be our two big drivers. Dairy cattle are having a different production and toward being aimed more towards milk versus our beef animals are more towards muscle. Yes, we have our mama cows that need to produce milk, but the quantity is different than our dairies. So in terms of breed difference between beef animals, I think it would take a lot of data points to be able to very definitively say if there is. In terms of breed difference, to me, I don't know if we're there yet for it to be a priority. I think our priority right now is simply just reinvestigating what water intake is at this point of production and the parts that impact it and those type of things. Then, so the water consumption data be applicable to feedlots. This data honestly is probably going to be that came out of this study could be used in a feedlot. The one concern that I have with it is the fact that our animals were intact, both the females and the males. So it might be something to take that into consideration. With them, I think the water consumption data that historically we've relied upon is going to paint a much better picture than potentially this study, just because of the impact of hormones on this one of just naturally occurring ones between the bulls and the heifers. And for water needs, I know it's been a conversation, but a lot of they've kind of been using that estimate of about that gallon to 2 gallons per 100 pounds of body weight to get them pretty darn close. But again, I think that water consumption data is going to be something in the upcoming years that we need to work with those folks that have, 50,000 head, 100,000 head that are up here in this weather to determine if they're seeing different cases. And a lot of those cattle live in an open lot all year round. So that also can impact our data against theirs because technically our animals could come in under a roof if they so chose. That kind of shielded them from some of the weather that they were experiencing. So as you stated, water helps with body temp regulation. Will cattle seek cooler water in the summer for heat relief? Yes and no. A lot of the times, they will go stand in water to cool off. So they'll go stand in a stock dam if they can. They'll go stand in a pond, a creek, all of those things to cool off. In terms of drinking water, to them, a cool drink of water doesn't do the same as it does for us. I mean, we can all remember the hot summer day where we go inside and have a glass of iced tea, lemonade on ice. It's cold when we drink it. For cattle, biologically, they seem to still prefer warmer water in the summer, regardless of it. And the thought process behind that is that their rumen or their stomach is essentially a fermentation chamber. So biologically, they are hardwired to decide that they need to foster that fermentation environment, and dumping gallons of cold water into that can really wreak havoc on those little bugs, microbes that live in that gut environment for them. So yes and no, they'll choose cooler water to go stand in, but when it comes to drinking, they still seem to prefer that warmer temperature water versus some cooler water, just for the biological reason of the rumen is what it's been attached to. Same thing also on the economic side of it. Cooling water is expensive. So kind of works in our favor on that one of it doesn't necessarily seem to make much of a difference in those warmer temperatures, whether that water is cooler or warmer. They still prefer that warmer side of the things, at least in drinking. Kathy brought up a good question of how many gallons per day in the winter. Honestly, if you look in our books, it says the same exact thing as in summer of a gallon per 100 pounds, 2 gallons per 100 pounds for our lactating cows. That being said, it doesn't exactly make a whole lot of sense for that. Some people will kind of naturally trend it down, but ultimately we're still using that same recommendation in the summer and the winter. Some people in the summer will kind of double it just to account for evaporation, all of those things. But that's kind of the question we were asking is there really is no good recommendation between summer and winter, especially for areas like here in South Dakota where we experience such severe of each way. That kind of answers the one of the range of gallons a month. So if I had, in this case, by the time my bulls were done, they were about 1,300 pounds ish. They weren't totally mature yet. They just are over a year old at this point. We're looking at about 13 gallons a day. And for 30 days in a month, that's just shy of 400 gallons. And that's just a very rough estimate with them. We were pretty on par, I would say, with that, with our bulls in this case. But kind of a good rule of thumb to start with that gallon per 100 pounds and size up from there. But it also kind of depends on a per animal basis. I had some animals that just seem to crave water more than others. And it's just like our people. I try to be a good sport with my giant water, but I probably only get through one a day versus some people that I know can get through two and a half in a day. So it kind of depends on an animal basis too. Stephanie, do you think that the amount of intake would change based on where water comes from? Absolutely. This is something that an extension was one of my hills that I would die on in terms of water quality. I always encourage people if they had a natural water source, that water needs to be tested, because whatever is dissolved in that water, whether it's dirt, salt, minerals, all of those things, that impacts what the cattle want to drink. It's just like us. If I handed you a glass of filtered water clean versus from an old farmhouse with galvanized pipes still, the taste is going to be different. You're going to maybe get a more metallic taste from the water that came from an old system versus that filtered water has a more crisp, clean taste to it. Cattle are very sensitive to that. Also, cattle are very sensitive to the palatability of water in terms of manure contamination. I think the rule of thumb that they found is if given the option between a clean and a dirty water source, cattle will pick a clean one, even if the dirty one only has a half a gallon or half an ounce of manure in a full gallon of water. And a half an ounce is like a drop in the bucket, and they will choose the one that has not been contaminated. Um, so that's kind of the big drivers. They're very sensitive to it if given a choice. Now that being said, if they don't have a choice, they'll drink what they have to get by. Um, but in that case, it just kind of depends on what we see for that. They do say that between cattle who were able to stand in their water source, like stand in their pond during the hot weather, versus animals who were fenced out and that same water was pumped into a tank, the cattle and their calves, it was cow-calf pairs, performed better if that water was just directly pumped out versus allowing them to stand in it, wallow in it, and all of those things. So there's a lot of research out there about water quality and livestock performance. And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, it's something that I encourage you to do because it's kind of amazing how finicky and picky that cattle can be as you move forward. Is there any data I can show or is it published anywhere? The easiest place to find it would more than likely be my thesis work. They're still trying to decide the best way to publish it into a journal. You can find it through SDSU. It's under my maiden name of Kavarna, Kov as in Victor, Arna. But it's titled Influence of water intake. If you look that up with SDSU, it should bring you to my thesis. It's relatively easy to find. That's kind of the synopsis of both the bulls and the heifers. There's not day-by-day data in there, but there's the diet tables. There's more about the equations, how we developed them. Kind of everything's all contained in there. So that would be my recommendation to find that. There's also an extensive literature review of finding other studies that kind of relate to everything that I've been talking about today. And then Kathy brought up I've seen 40 gallons a head per day for dairy. Does that sound right? Honestly, yes. I see Allie just put in a short extension article that I wrote in there that kind of goes off my thesis. So it's kind of a short and dirty version, but if you really are a glutton for punishment of reading research papers, definitely go find my thesis. That's got a lot in there. But for the 40 gallons per head per day, average dairy cow, honestly, at about, we'll say 1,600 pounds, they're usually pretty big girls, times two, or 16 times two. I mean, we're already at 32 gallons a day. And that is at the bare minimum. And dairy cows are producing more and more every day. So it would not surprise me if they were truly drinking 40 gallons a day on top of what they just naturally get through the feed. That would be very, very applicable, very, very honest, I think. The Climate Hub in El Reno, Oklahoma, had a seminar about temp of water and feedlots and the intake of water. It was last summer in the Southern Plains. So it sounds like some people are already looking into the temp of water in feed yards. I know that's something too of, do you offer cooler water in those feed yards where they don't necessarily have shade sometimes to go under in the same way that other cattle do? But Will cow-calf production improve in the near future, or is this not demand driven? I think at this point, we're at, in terms of cattle production, we're kind of at this waiting for the other guy to make a move point of the industry. It's expensive to expand your herd, but there's a demand for beef and the prices are there to allow us to do it. But buying a cow right now runs you 3 to 4 grand comfortably at this point. And a lot of us in the beef industry are that's a big bill to foot. And a lot of the times, sometimes depending on where prices go in the next couple of years, if we buy her now and prices tank in 2 years, she may never pay off her purchase price. So it's kind of in this weird space. I think we're starting to trend upwards, but also just hard to tell. I think this year's weather and grazing season is going to be the make or break it, whether we truly increase production. If we have another drought year right now, I think it's going to really pack a punch for a lot of us versus if we get a nice wet year where cattle can graze and we can justify having them on that feed bill versus paying to feed them in a dry lot. I think that'll also change. I don't think it'll be next year by any means, but I hope that in the next few years we start to see that trend move up and hopefully prices stay high. I don't think we'll see them stay high forever or this high forever. But ultimately, I think we will increase production in the upcoming years. Just not sure exactly when that's going to be. And I think this summer is really going to be that telltale sign of whether we're able to boost up or if we kind of have to stay contracted like we have been. I don't see anything else. So,
Yeah, sorry, I was
hopefully.
looking for my unmute button there. Yeah, thank you, Madison, so much. This was incredible. I have a atmospheric science background and not an animal science background, so I learned a ton today. This was awesome. Um,
That was the fun thing when we were designing this project and working with it is we brought two groups of people that very rarely overlap, even though we probably should talk more than we do in terms of weather and cattle production, because we do overlap a ton, but we never seem to get in the same room at the same place to sit and chat. So it was really fun on the design part of it and actually conducting the project in order to kind of bring both of those groups together. Talk with Laura, talk with Nate, all the people on the weather side of things.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This webinar was recorded. The recording will be available on our North Central Climate Collaborative website. Allie posted the link in the chat here. If you'd like to sign up for our newsletter and view our other resources on our website, that is all available there. Our next webinar will be on February 23rd at 1 p.m. Central Time. And yeah, we'd love for you to come back and join us for the next webinar. It'll be, like I said, February 23rd. Thanks so much.